Good morning. Senseless tragedies demand explanation. The normal reaction for all of us is to want some kind of master explanation. And as Jeff Swanson said, we want to put it in this box and say, it's mental illness, or, it's guns. Both of those are oversimplified explanations, but mental illness is the most popular one. In a recent US survey, 2/3 of respondents believed that mass shootings are primarily due to mental health problems. The popular solution then is to keep guns out of the hands of people with mental illness. According to long-standing federal law, people who have been involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital are disqualified from owning guns. After a mass shooting in 2007, there was a 10-fold increase in the number of otherwise confidential mental health records entered into the federal firearm background check database. In this database, now, millions of mental health records are now kept right alongside records of criminal offenses. These and related laws may be very well-intentioned, but they affect the privacy and rights of a large population of people with mental illness. In a single given year, over 11 million people in the United States experienced a serious mental illness. I say this all to point out that mental illness is not an other people problem. The policies that target mental illness haven't been driven by science, perhaps, as much as by stigma. As Paul Applebaum has explained, the idea of losing the capacity to control one's thoughts or behaviors is scary and alien, which translates into fear of mental illness, particularly in its more severe manifestations. We also have a strong tendency as human beings to pay particular attention to unusual events in our environment. So when acts of violence are committed by people with mental illness, they may be particularly salient in our minds. As tragic as incidents of mass shootings are, they are still, thankfully, very rare compared to gun violence or common violence that explains much more death and injury in the United States. Nevertheless, there have been some spectacular examples, high-profile public mass shootings where the perpetrator clearly had serious mental illness. Providing psychiatric services may have even prevented some of these incidents. These incidents are beyond salient in our minds, fanned in part by the media, as we just heard. The problem is that we overgeneralize. We assume mental illness is explained with most or all mass violence. When confronted with a new tragic act of terrible violence, we naturally ask, why has this man done this terrible thing? And a natural answer, as we've established, is because he's mentally ill. If we went further and questioned ourselves, how do you know that he's mentally ill? We would often find that part of our response is because he's done these terrible things. So mental illness seems to offer a tidy explanation for the ununderstandable, but the reasoning is often circular. This is one reason why looking at the profiles of mass shooters by itself is a limited approach. After a rare and highly publicized shooting, an excavation process begins. Interviews with friends and families, reviews of records, speculation, all bring into sharp focus red flags that often are only apparent in hindsight. The retrospectoscope, as Swanson says, indicates these kinds of common features of a mass shooter. The problem is that when we turn the scope into the future, it doesn't work well for prediction. For every shooter who fits the profile, there are tens of thousands of others with the same profile who will never be violent. So if we really want to advance understanding of the link between mental illness and violence, we have to do two things. The first is clearly define and measure serious mental illness in advance. Emotional distress, anger, suspiciousness, even indifference to life, often describe perpetrators of mass violence. But there are very policy-relevant differences between emotional distress and mental illness. A person with chronic bipolar disorder whose grandiose delusions impel him toward violence is not the same as a disgruntled employee who's fired and becomes so enraged that he seeks revenge. These are different policy issues. So our focus is on serious mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression. These are disorders that are well validated and can impair functioning. We also recognize that symptoms of these disorders come and go over time within an individual, which changes the relevance across time to violence. The second thing we have to do is triangulate mass shooter descriptions with much more rigorous research on physical violence, gun violence, and homicide. All of these are much more common and amenable to research than mass shootings, and they can be studied in a way that permits causal inference. So when we do that, we get 3 evidence-based points. The first is that mental illness plays a limited but important role in violence. Compared to people without mental illness, those with mental illness are modestly more likely to be violent. But the vast majority of people with serious mental illness are never violent. And if we cured mental illness today, that would be spectacular as an accomplishment. But as Swanson points out, 96% of violence in the United States would continue because there are a host of other contributing factors. Shifting to mass violence, Stone estimates that less than 1/5 of mass killers had a serious mental illness. The rest, according to his analysis, had personality or antisocial problems or were disgruntled, jilted, humiliated, full of intense rage. We could add seeking fame. Point 2, when people with mental illness are violent, it's often for the same reasons as people without mental illness. People with mental illness are people. They differ in their demographics, their life experiences, their personality features, their social networks, their neighborhoods, and their risk for violence. In a large study of psychiatric patients, perhaps the biggest one conducted to date, delusions and hallucinations were not nearly as predictive of violence in this population as things like antisocial and antagonistic traits, distrust, combativeness, attention-seeking. These are among the strongest predictors, just as they are in the general population. Third, screening gun purchasers for mental health disqualifying records has little impact on violence, based on the limited research we have to date. Jeff Swanson and colleagues have done 2 quasi-experiments on really large samples of people with mental illness, where they've found that those gun disqualifying mental health records explain less than 0.5% reduction in gun violence generally. They also add very little value to criminal disqualification criteria, which capture a number of these people anyway. Background checks, in general, are limited for a number of reasons, as we will hear later. So our conclusions are that policies that categorically restrict access to firearms for people with serious mental illness will do little to prevent gun violence on a large scale. It's also important to remember that there are real human and fiscal costs associated with applying these sorts of restrictions to a huge population of people. It is clear that gun disqualifying mental health criteria could be refined and made more precise. The lion's share of prevention that we would gain by doing that would be for suicide, however, rather than violence per se. Because the most robust risk factors for violence are mostly shared, not entirely, but mostly, improvements in policies and practices that keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people without mental illness will also go far in doing so for those with mental illness. This is the good news. How do we align policy better with what we know? We make a number of recommendations in the paper, some of which will be unpacked by other speakers today. I will highlight 3. The first thing to do is to develop new prohibitions on individuals' ability to purchase and possess firearms based on evidence-informed risk factors. These could be factors, for example, like repeated domestic violence convictions. We could do a much better job of identifying people who are dangerous for background checks. Background checks are a limited policy lever, however. So a second, and I think more exciting direction, is to implement new mechanisms for the temporary removal of firearms from people who pose serious risk of harm to self or others. These are colloquially known as red flag laws. They go under many, many different names and will be discussed later here today. They can be difficult to implement, but they are appealing, partly because the criteria for gun removal are not specific to mental illness, but would cover this population. These laws also recognize that guns are pretty available in our community and will sometimes need to be removed from people who have them. And they recognize that risk state, yours, mine, other people's, changes over time within an individual. So we can intervene with the right people at the right time, theoretically, if we can get these types of mechanisms right. Third, fund crisis intervention services for high-risk people, both with and without serious mental illness. There are two other very important recommendations, one of which you'll hear about from our next speaker, one that you already heard about. And in addition to media reporting guidelines that would prevent copycat syndrome, it's also really important that those guidelines avoid promoting unnecessary stigma of mental illness with speculation. But I want to end really on this note. I am a clinical psychologist by training. The mental health system very much needs better funding, but you will notice that we don't include fixing the mental health system as part of these primary policy recommendations. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. It needs to be done. It's not clear how to do it. But our focus really is on preventing violence. Delivering better services to people with serious mental illness could prevent an important minority of symptom-related incidents of violence. That's a really key point. Even more key, connecting high-risk people with or without mental illness to crisis services could really help. But the problem is a lot bigger than that. Many people at risk, whether they have mental illness or not, won't be in treatment and will never encounter a mental health professional. Mass violence is a multi-determined problem that can't be solved by any single sector alone. Not behavioral health, not law enforcement, not schools, businesses, or community agencies. They all have to work together to do this and do it now. It's time that policymakers, in my view, stop assuming that targeting people with mental illness is the magic bullet. Today, you'll hear a lot about what we can do to better prevent these tragedies, and it's time for us to take action. Thank you.